Hi, I'm Dr. Wilson. I'm a PhD molecular biologist, and welcome to my series on debunking the Disinformation Dozen. The Disinformation Dozen is a group of 12 individuals identified by the Center for Countering Digital Hate as being responsible for 65% of all anti-vaccine misinformation on the internet. And in this series, I'm going to show you why they deserve the title of Disinformation Dozen. This is the 12th and final episode where I'll be debunking the kingpin of anti-vaccine nonsense himself, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. RFK Jr. is part of the Kennedy family and currently works as a lawyer. But somewhere along the way, he became very anti-vaccine. So despite having any medical training or scientific training, he has very strong opinions about vaccines. But as we'll see, much of what he says about them, he completely makes up. I've made one video about him on this channel before, so if you want to check that out, here's the link for it. But this time I'm going to be talking about his claims surrounding the COVID vaccines. Of course, being the anti-vaxxer that RFK Jr. is, he doesn't like the COVID vaccines, and he spreads just as much nonsense about it as he does other vaccines. Anyway, let's start going through this interview that he gave during November of 2020. He starts off by talking about the COVID vaccine clinical trials, and what he says here has been repeated by anti-vaxxers everywhere. But make no mistake, it's not true.
They have geared back the studies so that to make them, as Peter Doshi, who is the editor of the British Medical Journal, and he said this in the New York Times editorial, he said these studies were designed to succeed so that you cannot fail.
The COVID vaccine clinical trials were just like any other clinical trial. Nothing was geared back, no corners were cut, and no steps were skipped. Literally, the only difference between these clinical trials and regular clinical trials was that production of the vaccine was going on while the clinical trials were being conducted. This was so that the vaccines could be used right away if the vaccines got approved. This is what happens in an emergency. But the actual science, the clinical trials, remained unchanged. There were still tens of thousands of patients who were enrolled into these trials. They were all followed for efficacy and safety of the vaccines for 3 months. Nothing was different. And yes, I've seen what Peter Doshi says. It doesn't check out. We'll get to that next.
Here's the problem. The way they measure whether you have COVID is that you have one positive PCR test. You have one positive PCR test and you have one symptom. So that could be a cough, it could be a fever, it could be a chill, it could be a headache. And you have COVID. So what they're testing the vaccine for is not what we want to know. Does it prevent you from dying?
The basic goal of a vaccine is to prevent cases of the disease from occurring. That's what these trials were set up to test. If you don't have any symptoms for COVID and you test negative, then you are not a case of COVID. That's what these clinical trials were measuring. Now, you can't have COVID deaths without COVID cases. So it's not a very big leap to say that by preventing COVID cases, we're probably going to prevent hospitalizations and deaths as well. Just because these clinical trials did not have the number of participants or the time to specifically test for those things, doesn't mean we can't say anything about what they'll do to those parameters. And of course, since COVID vaccines have been rolled out on national scales, there have been several studies that have confirmed that COVID vaccines prevent hospitalizations and deaths at rates on average above 90%. But of course, here was RFK Jr. in November of last year, before any of the vaccine clinical trials were even complete, spreading as much misinformation as he can.
The big problem with this vaccine, there's two problems. One is it does not prevent transmission.
Just a reminder that he's saying this before the clinical trials were even finished. So he has absolutely no business making conclusions about how the vaccines are going to affect transmissibility. We now have plenty of evidence to say that COVID vaccines do reduce transmission. And this makes perfect sense. Vaccines are training your immune system to fight SARS-CoV-2. So once your body encounters it, it's not going to be able to replicate very much in your body. So if it can't replicate very much in your body, you're not going to be able to spread it around very easily. And these studies that I'm showing you back that up completely.
The other problem is that they're only testing them for a month or 2 months.
Nope, patients in these clinical trials were followed for almost 3 months. That's plenty of time, as we're about to go over.
You're not going to see bad side effects till maybe a year out.
And this is an example of something he just made up. There is no basis to claim such a thing. Adverse events for vaccines almost always show up within 6 to 8 weeks of the dose being given. This is because adverse reactions to vaccines are usually caused by your immune system responding to the vaccine, and your immune response does not last months and months and months. So here he is making a claim without evidence that goes directly against the history of vaccines as we know it.
A lot of these, injuries that you get from vaccines have very long incubation periods. Autoimmune disease like diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, Graves' disease, Crohn's disease.
None of those things are caused by vaccines. He will claim otherwise, but the research does not support it. In the description, I provided a list of over 1,500 studies that show that vaccines are safe, effective, and are not associated with all of the things that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is claiming they are here.
And what Pfizer's doing, which is very dishonest, is as soon as it finishes the study, it unblinds it so that everybody knows you got the vaccine, you got the placebo. And then it takes all the people in the placebo group and it gives them the real vaccine. So now we completely are unable to tell whether there's long-term injuries.
It's like covering your future tracks, kind of.
Yeah.
Again, in order for this to be true, he has to make up the idea that long-term effects are common for vaccines years after the doses are given. That's just not true. The phase 3 clinical trials concluded after 3 months. After that, the patients were unblinded. Nothing was ruined. The clinical trials were complete. And moving forward, we can always compare vaccinated populations to unvaccinated populations. He is just making more stuff up and weaving himself into a web of lies. We know that COVID vaccines are safe and effective. By this, we do not mean that they are 100% safe and 100% effective. We mean that serious adverse events are rare, and when they do happen, they are treatable. They are so rare, in fact, that you're more likely to have any of these serious adverse events happen and be worse if you actually caught COVID itself. And without vaccines reducing the spread of COVID, you become more and more likely to catch COVID over time. So if you're worried about blood clots, if you're worried about myocarditis, if you're worried about long-term negative effects, then you definitely don't want to get COVID. And your best bet of not getting COVID is to get vaccinated. But RFK Jr., for whatever reason, is not concerned about your health or what is true. Instead, he seems to be just wanting to push an anti-vaccine narrative. And before I wrap up this video, I'm going to address one of the claims that he loves to make. On his website and in his social media, he loves to constantly claim that unvaccinated kids are healthier than vaccinated kids. His evidence for this? Surveys of parents who homeschool their kids. Nothing against homeschooling, but these studies are not very strong and are heavily biased. When we actually compare vaccinated populations with unvaccinated populations, we see that vaccinated populations have a lower likelihood of dying. Now, it shouldn't really be that surprising that preventing infectious disease in one group is going to save a lot more lives than letting it spread however it wants in another group. But what is surprising about these studies I'm showing here is that these vaccines, smallpox, tuberculosis, and measles, actually save more lives than what would be expected from just preventing the disease itself. These observations have been consistent in tuberculosis and smallpox vaccines, for example, but it's been best studied in the case of measles vaccines. It turns out that if you actually get infected with measles, you can actually have something called immune amnesia happen to you. In this case, it means that your immune system is essentially heavily weakened for about a 2 to 3 year time span. During this time, you're much more likely to become infected with and die from another infectious disease. This has been confirmed on a population level and on a cellular level. So not only do vaccines make a population healthier by preventing infectious disease and saving lives, but they also have unintended positive side effects to them as well. And if we ask this question today with COVID vaccines, we can already see that most of the COVID deaths occurring in countries where vaccines are readily available are occurring in unvaccinated people. Even unvaccinated people who suffer a serious case of COVID and survive have a chance of suffering from long-term health effects caused by COVID. We don't completely understand these long-term effects yet. So if anti-vaxxers are so concerned about long-term effects, they would definitely want to avoid getting infected from COVID. But again, they don't seem to actually be concerned with health. They are falling for fearmongers like RFK Jr., who twist facts and misrepresent science in order to fit their narrative that vaccines are dangerous. And that is why RFK Jr. definitely deserves to be on the list of the Disinformation Dozen. Well, that is it. That is the Disinformation Dozen debunked. This group of people is just the worst. I always try to give people the benefit of the doubt and not say that they're spreading misinformation just for money or selfish reasons. I like to believe that they actually believe the things that they're saying and that they're just misinformed. But this list has definitely tested that perspective in me. The amount of lying, grifting, and blatant disregard for what is true and human health in this group of people is staggering. If you really want to be informed and you want to understand good information relevant to COVID and vaccines in general, don't listen to these people. Listen to scientists. Listen to the scientific community. Don't even just listen to me. I'm not an authority on this topic. I just know how to read and understand the work of authorities on this topic. So in addition to the usual sources that I have linked in the description for this video, I'm going to provide links to people who can provide constant, good sources of information for vaccines and COVID. This list is not comprehensive, of course, but these are other good science communicators who are able to distill information for you. With that, I hope you have enjoyed this Disinformation Dozen series as much as I have enjoyed making it. Please feel free to share this series far and wide so that everybody knows that the people listed on the Disinformation Dozen should not be trusted. And if you want to see me debunk more people and communicate more science, then don't forget to subscribe. I'll be taking a 3 to 4 week break from my weekly upload schedule, but you'll still see some live streams and shorts from me during that time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.